So, hallo iedereen, hoi. As you might have been able to tell by the Dutch introduction and the orange sweater I'm wearing, today I want to discuss with you something related to the Netherlands. More specifically, I want to talk about this book, Why the Dutch Are Different by Ben Coates, and I want to open up a more wider conversation on the uses and misuses of national stereotypes and the kind of essentialization of a country and the people that live in it, its inhabitants, you could also call them. Now, why did I read this? Why am I interested in this book? My mom is actually Dutch, so I'm half Dutch. And this is why we had this book on the shelves. So yeah, I'm always interested in learning more about any country really. But right off the bat, I had some problems or questions. So for our first problem / question, let's just look at the cover. This is a very hip, cool, flashy, well-designed cover. Graphic design is their passion. On the back, it says that it is an international bestseller. And as someone who, yes, is half Dutch but grew up in Belgium, already the question in my mind is raised of, could this ever have been about Belgium? Could such a book with an entire design team, a PR campaign, a marketing campaign ever be devoted to a country as weird and relatively obscure and complex as Belgium? There are people writing about Belgium like Geert van Istendaal, but that they could rise to international fame in the book market, I doubt it. So it seems to me to be a question of who gets afforded flashy books like this. I was talking about Belgium earlier, but Belgium is still a quite privileged country in the sense that many people know where it is on a map, maybe know that the European Union has its Hauptsitz there. And so when I think of countries like maybe Ukraine or Moldavia, it's out of the question for me that I would see in bookstores a book like this on Ukraine being promoted. And so why is this? Is it the proximity of countries to Western Europe? Is it because we have this overarching worldwide cultural memory in which we just know a lot more about countries like America, France, Italy, because they appear in movies and because they lend themselves more to a kind of special romanticization? Because talking about Scandinavia and France and Italy, I feel like those countries are really the powerhouses of this genre. They own this genre. There are so many books like this on France and on Italy. And I feel like it's just that in and of itself is interesting to observe before we get into the deeper critiques. So let's do that now. Actually, before we get into that, I want to kind of ask a question to the audience, if anyone is watching this and willing to answer the question. And I would just like to know where you are from, which country you are from, and if you have a feeling that there are national stereotypes about your country, which stereotypes are they? Or do you feel like I feel like my country doesn't have any stereotypes, or people know so little about my country that there isn't anything to say on the subject? I'd be really interested in hearing about that. So in any case, Ben Coates, the author of this book, starts off by saying that, like Canada or Sweden, the Netherlands is a place about which everyone knows a little, but no one knows much. He then kind of journeys through the Netherlands and tries to capture the essence of the country in 7 chapters. Now, right off the bat, I went into this book with a lot of hesitation because I know about this good guy country trope and the harm that those stereotypes can cause. I would also maybe call it the exceptional country narrative, so countries like Canada and Sweden. So I thought it was funny that he bunched the Netherlands into that category because it fits really well. They're very well known for being progressive and very open and liberal. But I think there's a dark side to those countries that tends to be underexplored because of these positive stereotypes that we project onto those countries. And the first encounter I had with this critique was through Anne Thériault, who is a really, really nice woman, Canadian journalist and writer that I had the pleasure of meeting. And she published an article in The Guardian that was called "Canada's Niceness is the Very Reason Its Young Men Radicalize." So she talks about the national image of Canada as being very liberal and kind, and how that actually can do more harm than it does good. She says, "The idea that we're already a tolerant, liberal country is often a stumbling block for Canadians. We do not like the suggestion that we still have work to do, although you don't have to look much further than our government's treatment of Indigenous people to understand that we have a long way to go before the reality of Canada catches up with our perception of it." And I think much of what Anne Thériault writes about can be applied to the Netherlands. So yeah, you can see how already when a country is being praised for being so liberal and kind to everyone and open, already I'm like, let's watch out what we're saying. Let's watch our words, because this could turn ugly. And there are always in these books just so many truths or statements that don't match up. For example, on page 76, Ben Coates writes that it was exceedingly rare to hear a Dutch person express a strong opinion about any political issue, and unusual to hear current affairs being discussed in a bar over dinner. But when you kind of follow Dutch discourse, for example, about Zwarte Piet, Black Pete, I find it hard to believe that few Dutch people would get riled up over political issues, since there were literally Dutch people barricading highways because they wanted to keep the Black Pete tradition, like literally up in arms. And when we're speaking about Dutch people who don't look white, but are Dutch people nonetheless, they have very strong political opinions about stuff like Black Pete and about racism and discrimination in their country, the Netherlands. So I'm like, who are you talking to, Ben Coates? Or are the Dutch only white people with blonde hair, like the tall white people with blonde hair? So then on page 98, he starts the chapter on the Golden Age, empire, slavery, and the rise of Amsterdam. So I was like, okay, this is his chance to really explore this historically and then maybe link it to the racism and discrimination that many people in the Netherlands are still facing today. It's very important that he writes about this critically because, as he writes himself, the Netherlands in the mid-17th century imported more from Asia than did Portugal, France, England, Denmark, and Sweden combined. So, go figure. Still, as I said, 15 pages later, no mention of colonial cruelties, of slavery, of racism, but he does say that the Dutch on their part were also not always received very warmly by the locals they visited. One skipper arriving in Australia reported one of his sailors being torn limb from limb and 9 of his colleagues killed with a variety of arrows and spears or clubbed to death. But he doesn't mention anything about the treatment of indigenous people by the Dutch. He's extremely focused on Dutch people and what they experienced, and never recounts anything by people in Suriname, for example. So I thought that was weird as well. Then finally, 20 pages later, he gets to a sub-chapter that he calls The Dark Side of Empire. And he says that most visitors remain unaware of a national dirty secret. The Netherlands was one of the world's leading slave trading nations. Which is true, thank you for mentioning that. He also quotes historian Richard Olusei, who said that Amsterdam was the European capital of slavery. Then he kind of tries to historically contextualize Dutch slave trade, and this is where, for me, it gets really awkward, because he tries to project modern stereotypes about what Dutch people are like onto the past, and about the Netherlands' unwillingness at first to engage in slave trade. He says, the ever-sensible Dutch generally frowned on the idea of profiting from the export of people. And that phrase, like, the ever-sensible Dutch, because there's a stereotype that Dutch people are very sensible, and that this can serve as an explanation for why they at first were very hesitant to start trading in people. I think it's another example of the tight spot that you get yourself in when you're so set on trying to come up with national stereotypes that make sense. Like, ooh, those ever-sensible Dutch people, they were so hesitant about starting slave trade. Like, it just makes the hair on my arms and my back stand straight up. I thought that was really, really weird. He finishes up this chapter by saying, the Dutch had left their mark on the world, and the world had returned the favor. And here he was talking about how the Netherlands, because they colonized Suriname and Indonesia, had a lot of Suriname and Indonesian restaurants. And why would you think of using the Dutch had left their mark on the world? Yeah, they colonized these countries. And the world had returned the favor. Like, colonizing countries and them being present in your countries and opening restaurants is not an equal exchange. What a weird way of wording that. Then around page 231, Ben quotes start getting really, really weird. And that's when the dark side of Ben quotes starts surfacing. He has this chapter within the chapter on immigration that he titles Going Native. And by going native, he means that his views, just like the Dutch, shifted from extreme tolerance to something verging on intolerance. So he's saying that the longer I stayed in the Netherlands, the more conservative I became and the more xenophobic I became. And this is me going native and assimilating into Dutch culture. Like, how weird is that? He found himself agreeing more than I would care to admit with those in Oude Noord who would blame kut Marokkanen, cunt Moroccans, for dragging the neighborhood down. When I read that, I was just blown away. Like, why would you reproduce rhetoric that literally calls Dutch Moroccan people kut Marokkanen? What? Oh yeah, and he also unironically adds, why should I go to work at 8 o'clock every morning and straight to Dutch lessons afterwards when my foreign neighbors sat outside gossiping Berber all day? And this is really ironic because throughout the book he's always like, I went to a gathering in Rotterdam and I tried to understand the speeches that were being held, but my Dutch wasn't that good, so I didn't understand anything. And it's like, if you had an English neighbor, you would speak English with them. Don't try to tell me that you would speak Dutch, your half-assed Dutch, with your English neighbor. Well, I was very relieved when on page 282 he describes David Cameron's 2010 election victory as a victory I'd worked to help bring about. I was like, okay, so you're a Tory. You actively helped to bring David Cameron, the man who gave us Brexit, into office. It's all starting to make sense now. And that brings me maybe to my biggest critique of these kind of travel writing, exceptional country, I'm an expat and I moved to Sweden, I moved to the Netherlands narratives. And this is who is writing them. And I think in some ways it might also be a privilege in itself to be able to go to a country and truly focus on what is unique and different to that country. So why the Dutch are different. Because, and I'm no expert on this, but I know that there are entire theoretical frameworks whose main principle or main thought that it is centered around is the fact that anti-blackness is a foundational principle that governs all societies. So wherever you go as a black person, you will face racism, discrimination, xenophobia because of this anti-blackness that's so rooted in every country. And then for a black person to go to the Netherlands and notice, the Dutch aren't that different. They also call me racist slurs, and they have a tradition where literally hundreds and thousands of people dress up in blackface. So I think my main conclusion would be that we need other people other than relatively privileged white men from Britain to write these travel narratives, because I think if you're a woman, if you're a black woman, if you're disabled, you can name it, LGBTQ, you're always going to have a more critical lens to the country that you're in. And I think we need those different perspectives. It's time to move away from the Dutch are so different and they are so kind and they are blah, 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 because we need to open up the conversation, and we're hurting a lot of people by not talking about the problems that they face on a day-to-day basis in these countries. So if any people are watching this wanting to write more critical, diverse travel writing books, what do you call this? Please go ahead, I support you. En dank u om naar deze video te kijken. Dag!